I pin upon the map the most chilling and terrifying stories I have ever heard. Today, William reveals the terrifying truths lurking underground as utility workers risk their lives. Not everyone returns from the sewer maze. Share in the comments the horror legends from your city, and I will transform them into haunting and grim stories, utilizing all my writing prowess and talent. Taking a job as an underground utility worker, I knew I might face difficulties, but I never expected to find myself standing in the dimly lit tunnel deep beneath the city, before a wall of a remote culvert, covered entirely in sprawling, chaotic, bloody smears. These crimson marks climbed upward, as if someone or something had tried to escape, with no certainty if it had succeeded. A chill brushed down my spine, like an unseen hand touching me, sending a shiver through my body. I turned around, but there was no one behind me. The anxious drumming of my heartbeat seemed louder in that dead silence than the steady drip from the old pipes. The worst part was that these bloody imprints seemed to beckon me, promising to reveal some unspeakably dark secret my rational mind didn't want to uncover, but something deep and shadowy within my soul pulled me forward. At that moment, I couldn't even imagine the trials I was about to face, or the price I'd be forced to pay. It all began on my first day as an underground utility worker. The metal locker creaked as I opened it, glancing at my brand new gear. The utility uniform, heavy and slightly coarse to the touch, still smelled of factory paint and a faint chemical scent. I brushed my sleeve against the shiny brass name tag, checking its sturdiness before finally buttoning up the jacket. The job was necessary, and even when offered the underground tunnels, sewers with dampness, darkness, and all the charms of wastewater, I didn't hesitate. The old locker room had an odd aura. The dim fluorescent lights barely glowed overhead, illuminating metal lockers and benches marked by years of use. The ceiling was barely visible through the water stains from constant dampness, and the room seemed to breathe along with me. A faint smell of rust and something damp, like the muffled scent of a swamp, seeped through the walls. The silence was broken by heavy footsteps as a few men entered the locker room. They immediately noticed me, the new guy, exchanging glances that carried hints of mild surprise, irony, and skepticism. Their eyes lingered on me for a few seconds before one of them, barely hiding a grin, muttered, "Watch your backside, or John won't spare you." The comment was met with muffled laughter from the others. I tensed slightly. Noticing my reaction, the men added a few more remarks, this time with a touch of soft sarcasm about how not everyone stayed here for long. Their smiles were faint, but their eyes dark and wary. For a moment, an uneasy silence filled the locker room. That silence was broken by a gruff, raspy voice that seemed too close for this space. Ray, an older man standing by the doorway, looked at the other workers with a stern expression. His wrinkled face and eyes, glimmering in the dim light, radiated displeasure. Ray's gaze swept over them before settling on me with a cold, relentless seriousness that seemed part of his very being. He intensified the room's already somber mood, a bleak backdrop where old pipes creaked in the walls, emphasizing the oppressive silence that followed his entrance. And then, for the first time, I descended into the tunnel. The flashlight illuminated the narrow space before me, while the rest drowned in thick darkness that seemed to breathe. The air was damp and stale, and I could hear water trickling through the walls, as if something alive moved through the tunnels, watching my every move. Each step sounded muffled, as if the concrete walls swallowed the noise, turning it into a weak echo that immediately dissolved into the depths. I moved on, peering into the darkness, trying not to succumb to the creeping panic. But with each step, it became harder to ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone, as if shadows, lurking behind the dead silence, were watching. Hidden eyes in the dark, heavy and unseen. Pebbles scraped beneath my feet, and I flinched as the sound echoed in the distance like an eerie whisper. A bead of sweat trickled down my spine. The unsettling sense of another presence grew more insistent. I took a deep breath, gripping the flashlight so tightly my fingers went numb. The darkness in the tunnel seemed to thicken with each step. The flashlight barely pierced the inky walls around me, and once more, I felt the weight of that unseen gaze. The echo of my own footsteps sounded like an alien noise, as if someone walked beside me, in the dark, just beyond the reach of any light. The beam slid over something massive near the wall, an old metal box. It was battered, covered in rust and grime, as if it had lain there for years. I stepped closer and noticed that a name was scrawled on the lid, barely visible beneath a layer of dust. Property of John Matthews. John. Could it be the same one they mentioned in the locker room? The recollection of what I'd been told earlier sent a chill across my skin. My hand trembled as I opened the box. Inside were old tools that might still be usable, and a notebook with frayed edges. I glanced around, turning the flashlight to full brightness. It seemed odd, unnatural even, that no one had noticed it before. Was this some kind of prank on the new guy? It felt as though shadows from every corner were closing in, pulling me back into the darkness. My chest filled with a strange chill, and I quickly shoved the notebook into my bag. Why? I didn't know, but I wanted to learn who this mythical John was, the one they tried to frighten me with. After finishing the job, I brought the box back to the locker room. It seemed to startle my colleagues. They even recoiled at the sight of it. They exchanged glances, and someone muttered that the tunnel had been searched many times and nothing was ever found. I didn't offer an explanation. I just left, feeling the heavy weight of the notebook in my pocket. At home, comfortably settled in an armchair, I took John's notebook out of my pocket. The yellowed pages and worn cover gave it an old and eerie look. I opened to the first page, trying to piece together what really happened to John in those tunnels. The entries were chaotic, the dates jumping around, reflecting not a timeline, but moments when John would suddenly grab a pencil and, with shaky handwriting, record something that made him uneasy. May 17th. Nothing special, but it feels like someone is near. Must be tired. The next entry, apparently from later that same day. Enough. I see footprints again, wet as if someone had just passed, and when I turn around, they disappear. On another page, the words were smudged, barely legible. Something's following me. I can't explain it, but the whispering, it never stops. They seem to speak to me, taunting, mocking. John's handwriting grew more erratic, even frantic. If this is found, let it be known. I saw the shadow. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but it's real. It's here, and it wants me to know it. The more I read, the deeper the cold seeped into me. The entries became increasingly disjointed, fragmented, with strange marks at the bottom of each page, drawn almost in a panic. John frequently mentioned a presence standing behind him in the dark, never drawing closer. Reading this, I reflexively glanced at the door, making sure it was locked. My eyes lifted from the final pages of the notebook when the silence was suddenly broken by a sound like trickling water. Frowning, I rose from the chair, setting John's notebook aside with irritation, and walked to the kitchen, listening closely. As I neared, I felt a chill spread through the room, underscoring the strangeness of the moment. That's when I saw water pouring from the tap, a steady, unbroken stream glistening on the metal surface of the sink. I sighed, attributing it to old pipes, and turned the faucet off until the flow ceased. But as I was about to return, the sound came again, from the bathroom this time. Something unfamiliar and insistent hung in the air, like a weight that wouldn't ease. With determined steps, I headed toward the bathroom, my unease intensifying until I saw it. Water, streaming continuously from the faucet, splashing into cold droplets. I turned it off with such force that my fingers turned white, wiping my damp hands on my pants. Probably just the pipes. Need to check it tomorrow, I thought, trying to reassure myself. But the thought of worn-out plumbing didn't rid me of the strange discomfort. Exhausted, I made my way back to the bedroom, where the darkness seemed thicker than usual. Lying down, I felt tension seep wearily through me, and closing my eyes, I tried to let go of everything from the day. But the cold whisper of John's notes, the sudden streams of water, all of it etched into my memory, leaving a faint, sticky fear nestled deep in my mind. A few days passed, and work settled into its usual rhythm. Nothing abnormal or extraordinary occurred, just the cool air, the damp smell, and the constant background noise of water. No shadows or mysterious whispers hinted at in John's notes. I began to think it was all just a tale made up for newcomers. Perhaps even the tools with his name on them had been planted for added effect, to stir up some fear and mystique around these dark tunnels. Besides, the other workers appeared calm, going about their duties as if barely noticing me. All except Ray. The old man watched me almost incessantly, as if assessing me. He said nothing, only cast quick glances each time I ventured further into the tunnel. It was strange, but I tried to ignore it. Another descent into the darkness began as usual. The echo of dripping water, the faint smell of dampness, and the chill that wrapped around me as I sank deeper. The first few minutes passed in silence, and I was already mentally mocking my earlier fears. Probably just a tale for the rookies, I thought, until I heard it. A muffled, low thud echoed from the darkness. I froze, holding my breath. The sound came from afar, but seemed to come from above and to the side. Maybe a colleague working on another section. Listening closely, I realized the thudding had a rhythm, like heavy footsteps. Not hurried, but not entirely random either. They grew clearer until I felt a slight vibration in the walls. I swallowed hard, trying to relax, but something about that rhythm felt wrong, unnatural. It was as if something large, deep underground was moving closer. The sound swelled, shifting from a dull thud to an echo of footsteps that I could almost feel on my skin. At one point, it grew so close that I had to glance behind me. Silence. Only the faint hum of the lamps overhead and the distant sound of water. I decided to take a few steps forward, convincing myself it was just old pipes or settling concrete. But as soon as I moved, the sound came again, this time from the left, and I almost felt the vibration under my feet. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker in the distance, a vague shadow, but only for a second, like a fleeting glimmer. I looked at my tools as if they could somehow protect me from any threat, and forced myself to take another step. But the sound didn't stop. Now it echoed behind me. punctuated by dull thuds that threw me off balance, as if with each strike, something subterranean, unseen, crept closer with every step I took. As soon as the shift ended, I practically bolted toward the exit, feeling my quickened breathing echo in the dark corridors. Behind me, someone snickered softly, as if to say, "He's still young, easily scared." But I no longer cared. After another sleepless night filled with fragmented dreams, I realized I wanted to find out if there was really something down there. The next day, I brought an old iPhone I no longer used and carefully wedged it into a crevice between the pipes, right where the sense of unease seemed strongest. Let it record anything it can, I thought. Casting one last glance at it, I moved on to my usual tasks. The presence, that's what haunted me. It pressed on my shoulders, coldly trailing from my neck to my fingertips. If I stopped or stared into the darkness too long, I almost thought I saw shadows that never withdrew, never left me alone. When the shift finally ended, I quickly changed out of my uniform and, without a word to my colleagues, rushed home, barely holding back the trembling. Nearly breathless, I locked the door and placed the iPhone on the table, ready to play the recording. Carefully pressing the screen, I started the playback, feeling my heart pound in my throat. At first, nothing. Just an oppressive silence so tense I almost gave up hope. Maybe leaving the phone in the culvert had been pointless. But then, a whisper. I froze, straining to catch any word, but it was indistinct, like a blurred echo rising from the depths below. The voice sounded foreign, in a strange, incomprehensible language. The more I listened, the more I felt cold sweat trickle down my back. The whisper grew louder, warping in tone, almost turning into a chorus of voices, rolling through my mind and crashing in waves of darkness. And then, a long, piercing whistle broke through the depths of the recording. It was different, unlike any normal sound in the tunnels. Sharp, as if someone had stifled their final scream and let it drift among the pipes. Everything inside me clenched. And then, amid that cacophony, came a sudden snap so jarring that I dropped the phone entirely. As soon as the sound ceased, the phone's screen flared to life, bright, like a lit match. Flames leapt up from seemingly nowhere, making me reflexively recoil. My hands shook as I tried to smother the fire, hoping to save anything from the device. "This isn't a coincidence," I muttered, breathless, as I finally managed to put out the last embers. For a moment, I stared at the scorched screen, now riddled with cracks, feeling a deep, gnawing emptiness, an immediate realization. This was no accident. Days dragged on slowly, filled with an inexplicable tension that clung to me even after work. I tried to find any kind of clue, old records, traces of John, or anyone else who might have left a mark in these grim tunnels. But nothing. A week went by, and I was still wandering in complete darkness. That night, the phone offered no answers, leaving only smoke and the acrid scent of melted plastic. I thought I would lose my mind from the uncertainty, but I started convincing myself that maybe there was nothing at all. Maybe it was just old stories. And so 7 days had passed. The shift, like all those before, went by as usual, but I felt something calling me deeper into the underground tunnels. It was as if my own legs were leading me to where I didn't want to go. Around me, the cracked concrete walls, slick with moisture and slime, barely reflected the light from my flashlight, swallowed by the dense gloom. I approached the entrance to a narrow passage, where the echo of my steps suddenly began to fade until it disappeared completely. This time, The job was different, not solitary as it often was. I walked with a small crew, each person busy with their task, checking pipes, walls, and outdated equipment that had long needed replacement. My section stretched deeper into the tunnel, where the concrete was covered in mold and slime, and my own footsteps seemed swallowed by the darkness, muting their echo. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a dull thud and a string of curses from a colleague who'd tripped over a pipe, causing a small leather wallet to fall from his pocket. Another worker passing by picked it up, opening it with a curious glance. He froze for a few seconds, examining the photo inside, then looked at the owner with a cold curiosity. I watched as they began a casual conversation about family, exchanging small talk about mundane matters and duties. But with each word, the air grew heavier, saturated with something invisible that almost made my skin prickle. I desperately wanted to step away, to distance myself, but I couldn't tear my eyes from the expressions on their faces. And suddenly, the man holding the wallet changed. His face twisted in anger, and his words turned unnatural, even sinister. He stared at the father with a harsh contempt, gripping the photo tightly as he began to utter cruel accusations, as if blaming him for his own failures, accusing him of not treating his loved ones well enough. Finally, he added, almost through gritted teeth, "Soon, that family will be mine." I saw the wallet's owner snap, lunging at the accuser. A fierce, heated struggle erupted between them, like long-repressed irritation boiling over. My colleagues and I rushed to pull them apart, dragging the enraged man toward the exit, where he was barely restrained and taken to the surface. The others returned to their work in silence, as if nothing unusual had happened. I couldn't stop staring at them in disbelief. It was as if they were enchanted, or too absorbed in their tasks to notice such a strange and aggressive outburst. After the shift, Ray met me at the exit and gave a silent nod, inviting me to his office. His gaze was cold, almost wary, and each step echoed dully in the dim corridor, amplifying the sense of tension. In the office, Ray sat behind his desk and, with a heavy sigh, began to tell a story I never expected to hear, about a past buried deeper than these tunnels. Ray recounted how, when he first started working there, his partner was a young man named John, with whom he spent countless nights navigating these labyrinths. At first, John was an easygoing, friendly guy, always willing to help and dispel the heavy atmosphere with jokes. But gradually, he began to change. John buried himself in his work, staying in the sewers even when others had completed their tasks. He became strange and withdrawn, avoiding company, his face taking on an exhausted, haunted look. Ray recalled the day John simply vanished, as if swallowed by the darkness of the underground. Colleagues searched for him for days, scouring every corner of the tunnels, but found neither him nor his tools. No one knew what had happened, and any theories only added to the fear and tension among the workers. Since then, his name had become a legend, a silent warning to anyone descending into the dark depths. I tried to learn more, but Ray only muttered something like, "Things you can't imagine," and with another heavy sigh, ended his story. He looked at me with a soft regret, as if he wanted to say more but couldn't bring himself to. In the end, he simply nodded toward the door, letting me go home, leaving me with the feeling that I was only at the edge of what these tunnels hid. After that conversation, thoughts of quitting wouldn't leave me. Every time I prepared for a shift, everything inside me resisted. Dozens of reasons swirled in my mind, each one seeming like a perfect excuse to stop this madness. But again and again, I came back to the simple justification: money. The job was necessary, and quitting at that moment seemed insane. Yet deep down, I knew it wasn't just about finances. There was something else, a strange, unexplainable feeling that wouldn't let me walk away. Every time I considered leaving for good, a heavy, creeping anxiety would set in. It felt as though something hidden in the depths of the tunnels didn't want to let me go. It was invisible, elusive, but like a barely perceptible whisper, it murmured that it wasn't time yet. I tried to rationalize this state, convincing myself it was just my imagination, a consequence of Ray's eerie stories about John. But every night, as I got ready for another shift, I felt that invisible force pulling me back into those dark corridors, as if testing the limits of my resolve and sanity. Weeks passed, and though I tried to stay detached and avoid thinking about what had happened, the underground seemed to have other plans. One evening, when I had to stay late, I suddenly heard a strange humming in the pipes. It seemed to awaken from the night's silence, faint but distinct enough to catch my attention. At first, I thought it was just the usual sound of water or old metal joints, but with each passing minute, the hum changed, taking on the shape of a muffled, raspy whisper that occasionally strung itself into bizarre phrases. The hum that seeped through the cold, peeling pipes was subtle at first, but gradually swelled, filling the space around me with an invisible, almost tangible wave. In the tunnel's darkness, the sound vibrated like a living thing, following me closely and resonating within the walls, as if the very concrete was trying to speak. The mix of unintelligible whispering and heavy humming, like distant rumbling earth, turned into a surreal blend of noise and voices that seemed to sprout straight from the core of the walls. Step by step, I moved through the dark tunnel, filled with an impenetrable gray fog that made the air heavy and dense like night water. The weak light of my flashlight swept across the walls, revealing deep cracks and rusty stains that spread over them like streams of blood. The darkness here felt dense, almost hostile, swallowing the light and leaving me in a fragile circle of illumination that seemed ready to vanish at any moment. The hum in the pipes slowly morphed into something else, a chaotic murmur, fragments of foreign voices slipping out from around the bend and vanishing into the darkness, leaving behind a cold, unsettling echo. The words seemed to lack clear meaning, but there was a dreadful familiarity to them, as if these voices were discussing me, analyzing my movements. I stood there, feeling the chill seep into my bones, as I noticed the light seem to flicker, dimming for a moment as the darkness pressed closer, like a living black smoke. The sounds in the pipes shifted, muted clattering, strange hollow thuds, and a long, unsettling wail, like a voice from far away, so distant it seemed to dissolve into its own echo. The air grew thicker, and I started gasping in fear as the whispers turned into a heavy, erratic hum. For a moment, I thought everything had quieted down, when suddenly the silence was shattered by a piercing, dreadful scream that reverberated off the walls and lodged in my ears, as if it were more than just a sound. This scream cut through me, leaving a terrifying mark, binding me to an unseen entity lurking somewhere in the darkness. Then I felt something icy and lifeless brush against my arm. The sensation was so real I flinched, staring into the void ahead, searching for anything that could explain it. But there was nothing, only darkness. A thick, enveloping darkness that, with a slow, dreadful monotony, began to pulse once more, merging indistinguishably with the sounds and voices. It felt as if this endless darkness was alive in its grotesque way, and I was just a fleeting guest in its realm. My heart pounded wildly as I sensed an unseen pressure around me, and panic finally forced me to take a step back. But it felt like the walls were closing in, trapping me in this soundproof space. I glanced at the pipes again. They were silent, but somewhere in their hollow depths lingered echoes of whispers and the haunting remnants of the scream that would now follow me beyond this grim tunnel. In one of the narrow passageways, I spotted tracks leading deep into the collector. They stretched ahead to a place where no one should be. But these tracks, fresh and clear, seemed to beckon someone to follow. A heavy chill ran down my spine, and against my instincts, I stepped forward, keeping my eyes fixed on the prints. Pausing, I stared at the narrow stretch of the tunnel before me. The path was littered with strange marks that led further into the darkness, where the dampness and oppressive silence grew even more intense. In the thick gloom of the tunnel, I could barely make out odd patches on the walls. At first glance, they looked like random shadows cast by the cracked brick. But as I brought my flashlight closer, something much more sinister revealed itself. Bloody crimson handprints, as if left by those who had fought, desperately trying to hold on. These foreign palm prints stretched in different directions, intersecting and disappearing in a chaotic dance of horror, forming a grotesque map of fear and despair. They seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, appearing and fading, as if they were still alive and wet. One of the prints, responding to the flashlight, slowly grew more vivid. The fingers splayed as though an invisible figure was trying to push out, pressing its hands against the wall. I held my breath. The air around felt thicker and heavier, and each mark pointed to one conclusion. They were everywhere. As soon as I looked away, a dreadful premonition washed over me, and I felt I was no longer alone in the tunnel. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed shadows shifting behind me, subtly moving in the dark. Turning, I saw them gliding along the walls as if watching me. There were several, and with each step I took, they multiplied. I quickened my pace, but they only moved faster, matching each of my movements. The flashlight began to flicker, as if under their influence, and real panic set in. Fear tightened around my throat, but I lunged forward, feeling the shadows closing in, their presence nearly tangible, like cold breath against my neck. The corridor stretched on as I ran, but no exit was in sight. The shadows followed, blending into the darkness, their long shapes reaching out with unseen hands. My body trembled involuntarily as I finally reached the locker room and, mustering all my willpower, headed for the showers, desperate to wash off the sticky residue of fear and grime from this horrifying descent. The room was wrapped in a deep silence that amplified the feeling that the entire space was holding its breath, waiting. I turned on the faucet and stepped under the stream, letting it wash away everything that clung to me, resonating still. At first, the water was crystal clear, its cool touch burning against my tense skin, soothing and allowing me to take a deep breath. But in the moment I dared to close my eyes, the water suddenly thickened, changing texture and hue. At first, it darkened only at the edges of my vision, like a ghostly shimmer, but soon it turned crimson, slowly trailing down my skin in dark rivulets, nearly congealing on my hands and leaving deep red stains. I recoiled, instinctively reaching for the faucet to stop the horrifying stream. Taking a step, I slipped, my body crashing onto the cold shower floor, making it difficult to rise. Crimson streams seemed to flow around me, framing me as if in some ghastly trap. For a moment, the thought crossed my mind that it was just light, a distorted trick of my imagination trying to scare me. But then, I noticed something at the edge of my vision. On the wet mirrors lining the walls of the shower room, distinct marks appeared, as if ghostly human hands were pressing against the glass. Their outlines materialized from nowhere, as though surfacing through the mirror itself, demanding my attention. A chill ran down my spine, but I couldn't look away. The handprints, silent and still, seemed to beckon me into their eerie, invisible dance. My hand involuntarily reached out, but in that instant, the reflections blurred, as if the marks were blending with the dark, thick moisture still streaming down the mirrors. Suddenly, voices and laughter echoed from beyond the door, followed by a loud bang. Other workers appeared in the shower room, their shadows dispersing in the sudden light. They paused, seeing me sprawled on the floor, shocked and terrified. And instead of helping, they burst into laughter, throwing out jokes as they moved to the showers. I struggled to get up, but shadows still spun in my mind, trying to pull me back into the darkness. After a few moments of indecision, reality slowly returned, and I looked around. The crimson streaks and the prints that had once haunted my vision were gone, as if the steam had erased them in an instant, leaving only the clean, water-streaked walls. When I returned to the locker room, Ray was already waiting, observing me quietly from the corridor. His gaze was piercing, filled with restrained surprise and barely concealed concern. The signs of stress, clearly evident on my face, hadn't escaped his notice. He silently assessed my state for a few moments, likely suspecting that something extraordinary had happened to me. After a brief pause, Ray nodded, giving me a silent nod of approval to go home. I accepted the opportunity without hesitation, breathing a sigh of relief. At home, I didn't even think about food or other tasks. I threw myself onto the bed, and exhaustion pulled me into sleep, like a heavy dark blanket that finally protected me from the outside world. But the peace didn't last long. I woke suddenly to a strange rustling. For a moment, I froze, listening as my heart pounded in my chest. I cautiously got out of bed, trying not to make a sound, and reached for the bat I kept in the corner behind the nightstand. With it in hand, I crept toward the source of the noise. The rustling came from a small closet in the hallway, muffled and faint, as if someone was carefully moving things inside. Listening closely, I could even make out quiet, disgruntled muttering, soft, almost inaudible, but it was definitely there. Frozen in front of the door, I took a deep breath, raised the bat for a strike, and yanked the door open, flicking on the light. Empty. The items sat in their places, undisturbed. It seemed I'd been listening to my own hallucinations, but something felt wrong. My eyes fixed on the shelf where I always kept John's notebook, with the mysterious entries I'd found by chance. The notebook was gone. Someone, or something, had taken it. The sudden ring of the phone shattered the silence, making me flinch and almost drop the bat. My heart raced as the thought flashed through my mind. Could this be the continuation of everything that had happened today? But the screen showed a familiar number. It was work calling. They informed me that I was finally approved for a shift change. One of the workers had unexpectedly failed to show up, and I was needed for a new shift that morning. I stood still for a moment, considering how strangely everything aligned. Just a moment ago, I'd been searching for John's missing notebook, which had vanished after the nighttime rustling, and now I had to prepare for work as if nothing had happened. With a heavy sigh, I steeled myself and began to get ready, trying to push the strange events of the night from my mind. The shift was bleak from the start. This time, we were sent deeper into the collectors, places where the dim light of our flashlights dissolved into thick darkness, stretching through endless passages. The walls were damp and cold, seeming to breathe. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, the sound echoing through the corridors, reminiscent of the pulse of something unseen and ancient. Even the air felt denser, pressing against my chest, lingering in my lungs as if forcing me to breathe as slowly as possible. Mike walked ahead, his shadow flickering in the light of my flashlight, but even from the side, I could see something had changed in his face. Usually carefree and ready with a joke, even in these cold, narrow corridors, this time his face was tense, focused, with a rigid line to his lips, almost like a frozen snarl. Now and then, he would stop, clench his jaw in frustration, and punch the wall as if trying to ward off some unseen foe. His eyes looked wild, shrouded in darkness, as though they no longer belonged to the person I knew. Something made me stand up straighter when I heard the metallic clang of his tool hitting the floor. The key rang as it skittered against the wall, then rolled away into the darkness. Mike's darkened face dripped with rage, heavy and hot, sending a chill down my spine. He shoved a toolbox with fury, sending it crashing to the floor, scattering its contents with a chilling clang that echoed in every empty chamber of the collector. I wanted to say something, but my voice caught in my throat. Finally, I mustered the courage to speak when he turned to face me, and I saw his eyes, deep, dark, and filled with a hatred I had never seen in anyone before. They burned with a feral rage so intense that, almost instinctively, I took a step back. Mike's gaze, once familiar and human, now looked as if it belonged to someone or something else, like a dark shadow that had consumed him entirely. He held a hammer in his hand, his fingers clenching the handle so tightly that his knuckles turned white. At that moment, he lunged at me. I barely managed to turn and run, hearing his heavy, uneven footsteps behind me. Water splashed underfoot, spraying everywhere, while the walls reverberated with the sounds of the chase. The air thrummed with the echo of his ragged breathing and footsteps, growing louder with each passing second. Every turn in the corridor felt like an eternity, and every movement seemed agonizingly slow. At one corner, I heard him catch on a pipe, slip, and crash to the ground with a thunderous thud. He fell onto his side, his helmet cracking against the concrete. The sound, the echoing crash, finally subsided, leaving behind a suffocating, oppressive silence. Other workers quickly arrived at the scene. Seeing Mike unconscious, they lifted him and slowly, supporting him on both sides, guided him to the lift. I followed behind, the heavy weight on my chest remaining even as the danger had passed. With each step, it felt as if the collector walls were swallowing the sound of our footsteps, sealing the darkness of this place behind us. When we finally surfaced, Mike had regained consciousness. His gaze was focused, though a shadow of confusion lingered in his eyes. He frowned, glancing around at the colleagues gathered around him, and asked what had happened. The last thing he remembered was struggling to secure a pipe. I got angry, but after that, nothing, he said bitterly, wiping his brow. Ray, one of the senior workers, came over to me, and after a glance at the others, pulled me aside. His voice, almost a whisper, carried a note of concern, as if he were trying to warn me about something serious. He suggested it might be wise for me to switch shifts before I succumbed to the strange atmosphere that reigned in the depths of the collector. "There hasn't been anything like this since John's time," he muttered, looking me in the eye. But I, exhausted and weary, simply waved him off. Hunger and fatigue dulled all my thoughts, smothering them like a heavy blanket of apathy. Every muscle ached, and my thoughts scattered slowly, like fog. The only thing I longed for now was to go home, eat, and finally rest. Yet with each step, I felt a strange weakness, as if all my strength was leaving me, leaving only emptiness and cold in its place. The strange, dragging fatigue didn't pass, and the next day I barely forced myself to go to work, as if hauling some foreign, heavy burden. My entire body felt limp, and my thoughts drifted as if through a fog. I awaited the lunch break with even more apathy, despite having had a decent breakfast that morning. Yet the hunger only grew, as though an insatiable fire was burning inside me. Sitting at the table with the other workers, I opened my lunchbox and ravenously dug into my food without even looking at what I was eating. The stares of my colleagues went unnoticed until they silently set down their forks and began watching me intently. Only then did I notice their confused faces and feel the weight of their eyes on me. Surprised, I looked up and then down at my lunch. Amid the remnants of food lay raw meat. Red, rich, raw, still glistening with blood. Realization washed over me in a wave of horror. I had been chewing on this raw meat with the same desperation as a person who hadn't eaten in days. A wave of revulsion overtook me, and my facial muscles convulsed with disgust. Yet in the very center of that panic, somewhere deep inside, something dark and insatiably hungry stirred. A dull echo of satisfaction, the craving for that meat, its iron-rich taste. When the shift assembled to descend into the collector again, Ray cast a warning glance at me, one that was bitter and laced with some unfathomable fear. He pulled me aside, seemingly choosing his words to finally dissuade me, but I waved him off, unwilling to listen to any more of his foreboding tales. That look stayed with me as I went down, not just fear, but a look of despair and the silent echo of some deep-seated dread. With each step into the underground, the inexplicable, unbearable hunger within me only grew. A pulse emanated from my stomach, spreading throughout my body, sinking even into my bones. My mind clouded, and I barely kept control, as if some force was pulling me towards the unknown, compelling me to satisfy this wild, unnatural hunger. And then during the work, everything seemed to blur. I no longer recognized my surroundings, and all I heard was as if from afar, muffled screams, the clatter of metal, indistinct voices of my colleagues blending into the encompassing darkness. Something dark within me was finally satiated, and the hunger receded like a wave, taking everything in its path. Calm seeped into my body, spreading as a warm but eerie silence. Then came the pain, dull, searing, like a blow to the temple, and with it, darkness. When I came to, I was already standing near the lift. At my feet was a pool of thick, crimson liquid slowly spreading across the concrete floor. And then I saw him, the motionless body of one of the workers who had descended with us. His lifeless eyes stared into the void, and his face was frozen in a grotesque, horrified expression that seemed almost unreal. Something wild pierced through me. Disgust, fear, and the taste of metal. I ran my hand across my lips and felt a sticky wetness. Looking at my fingers, I saw the bright red liquid glistening in the dim light of the underground. The realization struck me cold and nauseating. I tried to say something, anything, when I noticed Ray standing nearby, his face focused and full of heavy understanding. Ray just stared, as if he had already warned me, and for a moment I felt that this old man had seen something like this before. Eventually, he stepped toward the lifeless body and silently grabbed its arms. Other workers gathered around, observing this horror with indifference, but their faces betrayed concern. They knew this wasn't the first time. Together with Ray, they began to lift the body, using their strong hands and knowledge of the collector's darkness, slowly carrying it away into the depths, disappearing into the shadows with their burden. I sat there, silent, as if hypnotized, until their footsteps faded completely. When they returned, their faces were serious, as if nothing that had happened could surprise them. We all ascended together, and my thoughts drifted toward the inevitable horror that awaited us, to the realization that the underground never truly released those who had been caught in its embrace. Ray allowed me to regain my composure, directing me to a place where I could wash and at least try to cleanse the fresh terror from my face. I felt the weight of his gaze, cold and assessing. It was as though he was measuring whether I deserved to know more. Finally, he spoke. This wasn't the first time. Other workers, as it turned out, knew about such incidents, but avoided them, masking their fear with a facade of casual indifference. Those who kept quiet and worked carefully, sticking to the safer sections, could remain here for years. But there were those who were drawn to the underground, who sought the truth. They were sent deeper, to places that did not forgive excessive curiosity. The underground had its own schedule, silently, methodically eliminating those who disrupted its silent order. For management, this seemed a convenient way to maintain balance, sweeping away traces of what didn't fit into the ordinary. I had become one of those Ray warned about, showing the same signs that John, the worker who had once been here and vanished into the darkness of the collectors, had shown. He left behind only a hint of the same wild hatred that had suddenly overtaken me down below. These same changes transformed an ordinary person into a being that no longer belonged to itself, instead succumbing to the strange hunger that awakened at the heart of the underground. Ray, it seemed, had long resigned himself to what I had done. He had seen it before, knew that it wasn't my choice, but something dark that had taken hold of my mind and body. That was why he had warned me, because he recognized in me something he once saw in John. He did not try to comfort me, only gave me a cold, silent understanding that the next shift might be my last, that the underground never released those it chose, and that I was likely already doomed. A few days later, when memories of that horrific shift hadn't yet faded, I was once again assigned to work in the deep recesses of the collectors. Management seemed unaware of my changes in behavior or the oppressive silence that enveloped those who knew what had happened. Sensing the tension and realizing that being alone again with these deep terrors was unwise, Ray made the silent decision to accompany me. And so together, we descended into the darkness. The deeper we went, the denser the air became, almost unbearable, as if the underground conspired against us, trying to trap us within its walls. The oppressive silence, interrupted only by the distant echoes of water, made the atmosphere heavy and permeated with a dark foreboding. In the dim glow of our flashlights, the walls seemed alive. They appeared to move, slowly flexing, creating the impression that someone unseen was watching every step. The darkness grew thicker, and within it, the shadows became more substantial, like spectral figures gliding along the walls, vanishing just as they came into view, leaving behind faint whispers. These whispers gnawed at the subconscious, awakening in me an uncontrollable dark fear that mirrored the terror I felt during the first attack. The further we moved, the louder the whispers became, as if someone hidden in the darkest corners was mocking us. Suddenly we stopped. The darkness in front of us seemed to part, and we heard footsteps approaching. At first, we saw a silhouette, hazy in the gloom, like a phantom figure cutting through the thick darkness. The lanterns flickered, illuminating ghostly features, a face that was familiar yet foreign. The figure came closer, and what we saw resembled John. His face was twisted with a sinister madness. His sharp, animalistic eyes pierced the darkness. They were clouded, yet within them burned a fierce, inhuman awareness that had overtaken every other emotion. His mouth, dark and stained as if filled with thickened fluid, stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing sharp, unnatural teeth that glistened in the lamplight. These teeth were so sharp that it was hard to believe they belonged to a human. They seemed like part of a dark creature awakened in this place. Around John, there was an aura of death, and the shadows seemed to envelop him, wrapping around him as if trying to hide him from prying eyes. His clothes were torn and dirty, and the skin beneath had an unnatural, ashen pallor that seemed to smolder under the light, appearing vile and decayed. As he stepped forward, an icy chill emanated from him, seeping into our bones and making us feel as though we had come face to face with something truly inhuman, something best left undiscovered in the dark. John froze in front of us for several dreadful seconds before casting a gaze upon us and breaking into laughter. It was wild, mocking, as if he knew something that was beyond anyone else's grasp. His eyes gleamed with madness, and his voice resonated deeply and unpleasantly, like an echo from the darkest depths of the underground. You can't escape. She is near, and she will be glad to embrace you. As soon as these words dissolved into the air, something terrifying began to take shape in the darkness behind John. I couldn't make out its details, but its silhouette, blurred, barely perceptible, seemed to be the embodiment of horror made manifest in shadow. An unknown entity loomed over them, radiating cold and a cloying sense of doom, as if even the air itself began to reek of staleness and decay. I stood beside Ray, still feeling the barely suppressed terror. Suddenly, as if an explosion of hunger erupted within me, it filled my mind with an insatiable, brutal need. It wasn't an ordinary hunger. It clawed up from deep inside, twisting my insides until my vision darkened. I turned to Ray. My body was seized by a primal, almost feral instinct, and now he stood between me and what I so desperately craved. The scent of his sweat and the dim glint of blood on his face compelled me to act without thought. I lunged at him, my hands contorting into a grasping motion. I felt my nails dig into his clothing and skin, mindlessly trying to hold him as I sought to satisfy the unbearable thirst raging within me. Ray fought back with all his strength. In his hands, an old, worn tool flashed, which he swung with all his might, striking my face. My vision blurred into circles. Dizziness overtook my mind. Yet even through the pain, I still felt that animalistic hunger driving me onward. Suddenly, something cold and rough grabbed my leg. Before I could comprehend what was happening, a sharp yank pulled me backward, and I heard the roar of an engine growing somewhere ahead. I was dragged across the concrete floor, quickly, relentlessly, brutally. A haze veiled my sight, but I felt the coarse surface tearing at the skin on my face, arms, and body. The once tempting scent of blood that had driven me mad now transformed into relentless pain, bringing with it the understanding that the hunger was retreating, and with it, the dark shroud that had clouded my mind was lifting. But the pain remained, scorching, an unyielding reminder of what had just happened. Every inch of skin left behind on the cold concrete burned, tearing my body apart. And I knew, one way or another, I was no longer who I had been. After some time, when the machine finally halted, I heard hurried footsteps approaching from where the engine roared. The thing that had been gripping my leg suddenly let go, leaving me lying broken and weak on the ground. The footsteps stopped nearby, and I heard Ray's voice, filled with worry, even shock. "Your eyes. What happened to your eyes?" My heart sank. I realized that all I could see was an endless darkness. At first, I thought it was just the mist clouding my mind, but now it felt like a deaf, irreversible void. Nothing, not even shadows, only blackness. The realization hit me with a wave of panicked dread. Sensing my uncertainty, Ray helped me to my feet. I couldn't hold back a painful groan. Every inch of my body burned, not just from the wounds, but from something else. The gnawing hunger that seemed to tear at me from the inside, leaving a searing emptiness. The old man supported me, each movement careful and deliberate. Step by step, he slowly guided me to the lift, murmuring something soothing, as if I were a small child. I felt every heartbeat and the unbearable pain in my torn skin, which stung with even the slightest touch. I asked to rest for a moment. Ray propped me up against something cold and solid nearby the lift. I tried to gather my thoughts, but the anxiety lingered, like the feeling before an inevitable fall. Ray said something, but suddenly everything changed. I felt his presence vanish. The sense of him standing beside me evaporated. Then I heard his scream receding, and panic flooded my mind again. Ray's cry was filled with despair, as if he were falling into an unknown abyss, and with each echo, it grew fainter until it disappeared completely. I stood frozen with horror, Ray's scream still ringing in my ears like a cold whisper that pierced my consciousness, preventing me from focusing. My back drenched in sweat. I hesitantly took a few steps forward, trying to remember the lift's location. I relied only on my memory and the tired sense of space, guessing at each step. Ray. His scream haunted me, filled with despair and pain that I now felt in every fiber of my being. I pitied the old man, though perhaps even more so, I pitied myself. He had saved me, despite my being a threat. And now, he was gone. Exhausted, I crawled onto the lift and leaned against the cold metal rails, holding my breath. I held it, waiting for the moment when this nightmare would be behind me. I felt the lift move, and with a whoosh came a burst of fresh air. For the first time in hours, I took a deep breath, sensing the stale underground stench recede, replaced by something cold and clean. But I didn't have the strength even to lift my head. My hands gripped the rails convulsively, though I could barely feel them through the pain and fatigue. I searched for any point of stability in this sea of darkness that had now completely enveloped me. A mixture of relief and pain wrapped around me, making me shiver. I was left in darkness, now unable to understand what lay ahead or what had happened below. After that incident, no one said a word, and that was not surprising. Those who had worked here longer seemed to understand what had happened, but stayed silent, eyes fixed on the floor when I passed by. I didn't hear gossip or whispers behind my back. It was as if the shift itself had buried all the details deep within the collector, hiding them under the weight of an underground silence that never released its hold. Management quickly and thoroughly brushed the matter aside as if they knew this was just another dark chapter in the unseen book of their business, a chapter best left unopened. They called me into the office, offered me a job as a dispatcher, said I could work indoors. For me, it was just an offer, but for them, it was surely a necessary precaution to ensure I wouldn't raise questions or bring up the past. And Ray, no one mentioned him again, as if he had never existed. His name fell from the workers' memories as if he had simply dissolved into the depths of those cursed collectors, becoming yet another invisible victim of whatever lurked below. I didn't know what had happened to him afterward, but his absence loomed over everyone, like a shadow pressed into the gray walls of the facility. I stayed on, now working above ground. They gave me a small room with specialized equipment where I monitored processes, took calls, and relayed instructions to those descending into the darkness. Sometimes, it felt as if I could hear voices from the depths, faint and fragile, like echoes that belonged to no one. They were ghostly, barely perceptible, but I understood they were not just my imagination. From time to time on the other end of the line, I heard the same whispers that had surrounded me underground, growing louder as someone neared the places where I had left my traces. I didn't leave this job, not because I had no choice, but because now I had another purpose. My presence was to serve as a warning. I stayed, ready to alert those who didn't know what awaited them below, so that at least someone would understand where they were stepping. I wanted to save them from what had happened to me, or perhaps save them from whatever had taken Ray, or someone else, or me. And with each passing day, the silence grew heavier, filled with the dull echo of distant screams and whispers that hid beneath the concrete, waiting for the next victim who wouldn't know what awaited them. Now, let me share a moment from my life. I am an artist, and oil painting is both exciting and relaxing for me. About 8 years ago, I became so passionate about oil painting that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day, I looked back and realized what knowledge I needed when I first started. So I prepared an intensive course of 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or unnecessary chatter, just rich content that is immediately applicable in practice, all for the price of 1 day of car rental. Art therapy is a great way to cope with your anxieties. Link in profile or description.